Welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and this is the immune system. So the first way that we can think about the immune system is kind of what we're born with and protects everybody the same way against a wide variety of substances, or our innate defenses, and then our adaptive defenses, which you're not born with. You have to actually encounter a pathogen to develop adaptive defenses, and that's kind of the first two ways that we break down the immune system. Another way that we can think about it as far as like lines of defense. We've got a first and second line of defense that are part of our innate defense, and our third line of defense is when we kick in our adaptive immunity or our specific lymphocytes. So we'll get there as we move throughout lecture today. So our first line of defense is part of this innate defense. Innate defense is something that we're born with. So we're born with, and it protects against a wide variety of substances in the same way, or a wide variety of pathogens or potentially harmful substances in the same way. So protects against wide range of substances. We could say pathogens, antigens, etc., allergens, splinters. So protects against a wide variety or a wide range of substances the same way. So it doesn't get really better with time. So the first way that we can do something is to prevent the entrance of materials into our body. And your skin doesn't get better with time at that. You're born with skin, and your skin's always going to hopefully prevent the entrance of materials into your body. So that's kind of an example of that. So you're born with your innate defenses, and they are going to protect against a wide variety of substances in the same way. Adaptive defenses you are not born with. Adaptive defenses you acquire as you encounter pathogens out there in the environment. And so you develop this immunity and you get cells that are specific to it. What's really cool about adaptive defenses is that it is specific and it has memory. So we'll talk a lot more about that. Adaptive, this is, we'll say this is our specific immune response. And we'll say it's acquired with pathogen or antigen encounter. Acquired with antigen encounter. All right. So, this innate defense has two lines of defense, or two branches, and this adaptive defense has one. So let's first look at our first line of defense. And what our first line of defense is protecting against is the entry of pathogens or foreign materials into your body. So if we look at the structures of the first line of defense, that's your skin and your mucous membranes, and these are both going to help prevent the entrance of pathogens or foreign materials into your body. So they prevent the entrance of foreign materials into your body. And so your skin and intact epidermis and dermis are going to be able to prevent the entrance of pathogens. If, say, you hurt your finger, then that is not going to prevent the entrance of pathogens. That's an area where pathogens can get right in. So for our skin, and this is actually true of both of these things, for these to prevent the entrance of pathogens, they have to be intact. So our intact skin and mucous membranes are going to prevent the entrance of pathogens into our body. And how are they going to do this? Well, our skin provides a physical barrier. It also has a chemical barrier. I mean, the physical barrier is not hard to understand. It's an actual physical membrane that separates you from the external environment. Chemical barrier, what do I mean by that? Well, if you remember, skin, the epidermis of your skin, is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. That keratin gives you some waterproofing, so that can actually help prevent the entrance of some things into your body. So keratin is kind of one part of the chemical barrier. But then we also have your sweat, which is rich in like urea, uric acid, waste products, so it actually creates what's called the acid mantle of the skin, which is the slightly acidic pH of the skin due to sweat, and so that's going to be another kind of chemical barrier. And then there's also biological barriers from the cells that are present. So your skin is pretty darn good at preventing the entrance of stuff. For our chemical barriers, we'll say we've got the acid mantle of the skin, which is the low pH of the skin due to sweat. This is antimicrobial. Another part of the chemical barrier, keratin. And this resists, we could say, the absorption of toxins and things. Or I'm just going to say the absorption of materials. What else in the sweat? I believe that there's an antibody, IgG or something that we can find in sweat. So that's part of the chemical barrier. For our biological barrier, these would be cells that live in the skin that are able to do something. So does anybody remember from last semester what the only resident cells that do any kind of immunity for the epidermis are? They're the dendritic cells that are phagocytes. So that's one part of the biological barrier. But then if you look down in the dermis where we do actually have blood supply, you can have macrophages that run in and out. And then there are also resident mast cells that are kind of important. Those are going to be more part of our second line of the defense. Our second line of defense, the cells that we get to, but as far as skin goes, it also forms a biological barrier because it's got these living parts that are going to help prevent the entrance of foreign materials into your body. So, biological barrier, we could say the skin contains phagocytes and mast cells that are going to help act as a biological barrier. Okay, mucous membranes, intact mucous membranes, what do they have? Well, mucus, depending on where you look, is going to determine what the mucous membrane is doing. So if you look at the mucosa of your respiratory tract, that mucus is going to entrap debris, and let's say in your nasal cavity, the ciliated cells there are going to beat that mucus back, and then you'll swallow it down your pharynx, and it'll go through your esophagus to your stomach where there's hydrochloric acid. So that's going to be one thing to be aware of as far as the mucous membranes go in your respiratory tract. When you get lower down in your respiratory tract, you also have ciliated cells that beat the mucus up in what's called the mucus escalator. So that beats the mucus up to the pharynx for the same reason. If you get the mucus to the pharynx, you can swallow it, and then you can deal with it in the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. What else about mucous membranes? Like you've got in the mucous membrane of your oral cavity, you have saliva, which has antibodies in it that can help. Also contains this enzyme called lysozyme. Lysozyme we find in many body secretions. So lacrimal fluid has lysozyme, some saliva has lysozyme. I think sweat has some lysozyme in it too. And what lysozyme is an enzyme that's antimicrobial. If you think about zyme, that's an enzyme. Lyso, what does it do? It causes cell lysis. So that's going to be another important thing that we get from mucous membranes. So we can think about different parts of mucous membranes, ciliated cells in the respiratory tract, propel mucus to the esophagus, propel mucus to the pharynx so you can swallow it. at the mucosa of the stomach, it's secreting hydrochloric acid, so that's definitely antimicrobial. So that would be another thing. The mucosa in the GI tract, we could say our GI tract mucosa contains digestive enzymes. This is also antimicrobial. So this swallowing it is why this matters. The hydrochloric acid in your stomach is going to digest most microbes. You could also say that like your oral mucosa, saliva contains lysozyme. Lysozymes in a lot of stuff. So basically by trapping debris in mucus, we can give some innate protection and hopefully prevent the entrance of a variety of substances through those mucous membranes into our body. So just imagine which mucous membrane or which organ you're thinking about, and you can imagine what the mucous membrane does. In the respiratory system, it traps debris and propels that mucus to the pharynx. In the digestive system, the mucous membrane is secreting the digestive enzymes that are helping give this barrier. So those are the structures of our first line of defense. So the structures of the second line of defense are cells, our phagocytes, and natural killer cells. But then our second line of defense has these generalized body responses. The inflammatory response, which has some inflammatory chemicals that are going to be involved. We'll also talk about some other protective chemicals that are antimicrobial proteins. Fever is another whole body response that can happen in response to illness in the body. So let's start by talking about our cells. The phagocytes are our neutrophils and our macrophages. Neutrophils are phagocytic for bacteria. When a neutrophil eats a bacteria, it eats a bacteria, does phagocytosis, processes it, and dies. So neutrophils are actually kind of better when they do this thing called respiratory burst. If you recall when we talked about blood, we went over this process, and in respiratory burst, a neutrophil will take all of its lysosomes and put them up to its cell surface and let them degranulate, or release all of the digestive enzymes. When that happens, it kills the neutrophil, but it also creates an antibacterial kill zone that kills the bacteria in the area. So neutrophils are phagocytic for bacteria, but they also do respiratory burst. I'm not going to write that down again because that was just a review, and we've already talked about it, so you should know it still. Macrophages are phagocytic for anything foreign. So they'll try and gobble up a splinter, a bacteria, a virus, whatever. So these are phagocytic for anything foreign. All right. So those are our phagocytes. Natural killer cells are our next type of cell, and natural killer cells are really our anti-cancer cells. So when a cell is undergoing unregulated DNA replication, that can be indicative that a cancerous process is going on, and natural killer cells will induce apoptosis in those cells. They can also induce apoptosis in any virus-infected cell. They do so by injecting these things called perforins and granzymes. So let's just imagine for a minute, this is our sick cell, and our natural killer cell, or this is our cancerous cell, and our natural killer cell comes along and recognizes this. So what it's going to do is it's going to release these chemicals called perforins. So it releases perforins. And these are proteins that are going to punch a hole or perforate a hole in the plasma membrane. So these create a hole in the membrane. And then the natural killer cell is going to inject a lethal dose of these things called granzymes. So we'll release perforins and granzymes. And our granzymes are enzymes that induce apoptosis. What is apoptosis? Shriveling up and dying. So now this cell, this cancerous cell, will shrivel up system. So natural killer cells can also do this in virus-infected cells, but they'll do that for any virus-infected cell. We'll see our T lymphocytes, our specific lymphocytes, are only going to fight specific virus-infected cells. Talk about that in a little bit. All right. So the next part of our second line of defense is the inflammatory response. And the inflammatory response is a generalized response to any tissue damage or injury. So it's a generalized response to any tissue damage or injury. So there are kind of actually lots of benefits to an inflammatory response. As it swells, it's going to hurt and you're going to protect it. So it causes pain and you protect it, or so you protect the area of injury. Another benefit is that it allows for white blood cells to get to the area. So it allows for white blood cells to get to the area, and they can then fight any potential introduced antigen or pathogen. They can also help to heal. So it sets the stage for healing. And it's going to wash the wound. So if we introduce anything that we need to get to a lymph node and say start an immune response, we can wash that into the lymph that is draining there. And so we can say the inflammatory response washes the wound, and so we'll say it's going to set the stage for an immune response if needed. So you recall when we talked about lymph, we said that it forms as the extracellular fluid from capillary exchange drains into lymphatic capillaries. Well, in an inflammatory response, as we'll see, we're going to bring a lot more blood to the area. So if we get a lot more blood to the area, there's a lot more plasma to the area, and we push that all out. So now the 15% that gets stuck there is a lot bigger than the 15% in a normal capillary bed. This extra fluid is called exudate, and it washes the wound so that if there was any bacteria or debris or anything like that, we pull it into the lymphatic capillaries, and then we can run it past the lymph node, where we have macrophages that can deal with the debris, and we've got lymphocytes that can mount a specific immune response. So this is actually pretty important. Okay. So what are the cardinal signs of the inflammatory response? And then we'll talk about what causes each, that related to the benefits, and then we'll talk about all of the stages of the inflammatory response. So we've all experienced inflammation. What do we see? We see redness. And this is due to increased blood flow to the area. We see heat. This is also due to an increase in blood flow. Blood is hot, but also these damaged cells in the area are going to start doing a lot of stuff. They're going to become metabolically active, which is going to increase the heat in the area as well. We also see swelling. Now this is going to be due to the increase in blood flow, but it's also due to the increase in exudate. And this exudate, I'm going to put in parentheses here, is the extracellular fluid rinsing the capillary bed. No, I'll say rinsing the area. And then we get pain. And this pain is due to the swelling. As you swell in the area, you're going to start pushing on nociceptors, and it's going to hurt. This is going to cause you to protect it. So the pain is due to swelling, pushing on our nociceptors. And so now we're protective. been looking for this pointer. Okay, so what are the stages of the inflammatory response? We one stage leads to the next. So the first thing that we'll talk about is inflammatory chemical release. And if you recall, we said connective tissues have resident cells called mast cells that release pro-inflammatory chemicals. So that's going to help to set up the stage for our next kind of steps. So the stages of the inflammatory response, the first stage is inflammatory chemical release. And what happens here is that our resident mast cells are going to release chemicals like histamine, which is a vasodilator. So all of the blood vessels in the area are going to vasodilate. We'll get more blood to the area. And then heparin is going to prevent any coagulation in the area. So our resident mast cells release histamine and heparin. Histamine is a vasodilator, and heparin is an anticoagulant. And so this is going to allow for an increase of blood flow to the area. The other thing that will happen is cells in the damaged tissue will release what are called chemotactic factors. So our cells in the damaged tissue release chemotactic factors. So what are these? Chemotaxis is what they're going to stimulate. This is chemical movement. Taxis move you around. Chemotaxis moves cells around. So our white blood cells are going to follow this chemical trail right to the site of damage. So let's just actually draw up a blood vessel and imagine what's going on here. So let's say this is the site of an inflammatory response. And you know that normally we've got our endothelial cells that are just lined up right next to each other. But now we've had some damage. So what's going to happen? Well, histamine is going to vasodilate all of the things in the area. So now we get more blood flow here. The other thing that's going to happen is the size of our intercellular clefts is going to increase. So our capillaries are going to become super leaky. We're going to increase their permeability. And then the cells here are also going to be releasing these chemotactic factors. So all these chemotactic factors are going to go up high in the interstitial space. And as blood is flowing past here, our white blood cells are going to be able to follow that chemical trail right to the site of tissue damage. So another thing that we could say is that our capillaries become super leaky, or our capillaries become leaky as intercellular clefts increase in size. And so now we've got bigger blood vessels because they're dilated, and we've got these bigger intercellular clefts, so we become super leaky. And now our cells in the area are going to release chemotactic factors, which are going to stimulate this process called chemotaxis. So cells release chemotactic factors, that attract white blood cells to the area. So, chemotactic factors, what are these? Chemotaxis is the process of following a chemical trail or moving to an area based on a chemical trail. So taxis move you around, chemicals move white blood cells to the area of damage. So blood is rushing really fast through your body, and so what's going to slow these cells down and let them know where to go? Well, the chemotactic factor is going to draw them there. Another vascular change that happens is the endothelial cells are going to start expressing these things called or CAMs. So these cell adhesion molecules stick off of the endothelial cells, and what happens then is as our white blood cells are going by, they're going to stick to these cell adhesion molecules and roll along the blood vessel, and then be able to follow this chemotactic trail out. So right now, this is like the last part of our chemical step, our inflammatory chemical release, is that the damaged cells are going to release chemotactic factors that will attract white blood cells to the area. Okay. The second stage, then, after inflammatory chemical release, is vascular changes. I kind of already talked about them, but let's sum it up as its kind of own step. So, vascular changes. We'll say the endothelium expresses CAMs, which are cell adhesion molecules. So cell adhesion molecules, and these will slow white blood cells down. The other vascular change that's going to occur is that we will have vasodilation. So we'll have more blood flow to the area. This increased blood flow is going to increase blood plasma. As you recall, we'll push out all of that plasma on the arterial side of the capillary bed, but only pick up 85% of it on the venous side. That remaining extra 15% now is going to become that exudate that washes the fluid, or the exudate that washes the wound. What else are we going to see? We're going to see an increase in intercellular cleft size. And this is going to increase the permeability of the capillary. So the chemicals cause these changes, and now these changes are going to help set the stage for the next step, which is leukocyte mobilization. So step 3, leukocyte mobilization. Our white blood cells are going to follow this chemical trail out to the site of damage and do their thing. So our third step, leukocyte mobilization. And this kind of has two parts. Margination is when we slow down and roll along these CAMs. Margination. White blood cells roll along our capillary wall or our vessel wall, sticking to our CAMs. And when they start getting to this area where our chemotactic factors are really high, they're going to know it's time to get out. So they're going to follow that chemotactic trail out to the site of damage, and they're going to squeeze through these big intercellular clefts, and that squeezing through is a process called diapedesis. Dia means through, pedesis is referring to like walking, so the cells like walk through, it squeezes through our intercellular clefts so that it can get out there to the tissue. So our white blood cells squeeze through the intercellular clefts, the increased intercellular clefts, and follow the chemical trail or follow our chemotactic factors to the site of damage, or to the site of the injury. Okay, so those are the stages of the inflammatory response. And what we can say now, just to kind of bring it all together with things that we've already learned, is that this increase in extracellular fluid is going to produce this fluid that we're going to call exudate. And exudate is going to wash that wound so that we can drain into lymphatic capillaries, that will drain into lymphatic vessels, that will run past lymph nodes so that we can start an immune response there if something was introduced to the body. So the last kind of thing to be aware of is that the increase in extracellular fluid formed due to the increase in blood flow is exudate that washes the wound our lymphatic capillaries pick up exudate and run it past lymph nodes to start an immune response if needed. That's the inflammatory response. Alright, so which is not one of the cardinal signs of an inflammatory response? A. Swelling. B. Redness. C. Fever. D. Pain. I feel like start doing a dance or something during this time. I'm trying to figure out like a good thought. The answer is fever is not one of the cardinal signs of an inflammatory response. It's another generalized body response that we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay, so antimicrobial proteins are another part of your second line of defense. And there are a couple types. We're going to talk first about these things called interferons. And if you remember, at the beginning of the semester, when we talked about chemical signaling, we were talking about endocrine signaling and paracrine and autocrine and all of that. Well, this is where autocrine and paracrine come into play. So, interferons are chemical signals that are released by virus-infected cells and bind to receptors on neighboring cells and cause them to upregulate their antiviral protein production. So, interferons. This is a message sent by a virus-infected cell to bind receptors on neighboring cells and cause them to upregulate their antiviral properties. So, interferons. Message is sent by virus-infected cells to bind receptors on neighboring cells and cause them to upregulate their antiviral properties. So if the effect is at a neighboring cell, what kind of signaling is an interferon? Endocrine? Paracrine? Neurocrine? Autocrine? It's paracrine. Para means near, crine means chemical signal. This is a chemical signal that's affecting cells nearby. So, what happens? Let's say here's our virus-infected cell. What viruses do is they actually hijack your own DNA. So the virus comes in here and binds to your DNA to get your DNA to replicate the virus. And what happens then is this turns on your own interferon gene. So interferons are then produced and released from the virus-infected cell. It'll bind to interferon receptors in the neighboring cell, and now the neighboring cell can produce proteins that block viral replication in themselves. Pretty cool. Okay, so a second type of antimicrobial protein is actually, there are a ton, but it's part of what's called the complement system. So there's something like 30 or more complement proteins that are activated in response to different kinds of pathogens in the body, and they do different things. You can go cascade in an immunology class someday. For now, we're just going to talk about 3. So opsonization, which is flagging something for removal by a phagocyte, enhancing inflammation, and causing cell lysis. So the complement system, we can say that these complement proteins, it's a group of about 30 proteins that help mark pathogens for removal. So the first thing that complement proteins can do, some of them can line up in a cell membrane and form what's called a membrane attack complex, or a MAC. So the complement proteins will line up and basically form this pore, and so whatever's inside the cell can get out, whatever's outside the cell can get in, and so that causes the cell to lyse. So we could say one of the things that the complement system does is cause cell lysis by forming these membrane attack complexes. So complement proteins cause cell lysis by forming MACs, which is a membrane attack complex. So that'll form a pore in the cell, whatever's inside the cell gets out, whatever's outside the cell gets in, and the cell lyses. Another thing that they can do is they can just enhance, complement proteins can enhance inflammation, can be part of these chemotactic factors that assist in the inflammatory response. And then the other thing that they do is stimulate what's called opsonization. Opsonization. So what happens in opsonization then is our complement proteins are going to act like a flag. So let's just say, I don't know, this is a bacteria or something. I can stick a protein, a complement protein on it, and now a phagocyte can see this and more readily ingest it. So opsonization is marking for removal by a phagocyte. All right. So our complement system, again, can induce cell lysis, enhance inflammation, or stimulate opsonization. Fever. What is fever? Fever is an abnormally high body temperature that your hypothalamus allows to occur. So if you recall, body temperature regulation was one of the first examples of negative feedback that we used. And we said that the thermoregulatory center in your hypothalamus is paying attention to your body temperature. It's doing that by sensing how hot blood is. And normally, when blood goes above 98.6, the hypothalamus will kick in efferent messages that stimulate effectors to bring your body temperature down. When you're sick, the hypothalamus doesn't do this. So how does the hypothalamus know you're sick? Well, your infected cells release these things called pyrogens. And as pyrogen level goes up in your blood, the hypothalamus can tell you're sick, so it will temporarily override and allow your body temperature to go up. So, what is fever? It's an abnormally high body temperature that the hypothalamus is just going to let happen. So I'll say not corrected by the hypothalamus. And what are the benefits of fever? Well, when you have an increase in temperature, you have an increase in enzyme activity, an increase in metabolism. So your cells can do more of what they do and just kind of hopefully get your immune system going and an immune response going so that we can wipe the pathogen out of your system. So that's one thing, is we can increase metabolism. The other thing is that it will cause your liver to sequester iron. What does that mean? Sequester means to uptake and hold on to it. Microbes need iron for normal functioning, so by sequestering iron, you can help kind of prevent microbe growth and formation in the body. And then also, because we're increasing our metabolism and we're sick, fever is also going to make you tired and cause you to rest. So while you're resting, your body can be doing everything that it needs to do to fight the pathogen. So the benefits of fever are an increase in metabolic rate for clearing the pathogen. And this is also going to make you tired and you rest. Kind of a more physiological thing is that it's going to cause the liver to sequester iron. And that's fever. All right. So if your first and second lines of defense fail, then you're going to engage your adaptive response, or your third line of defense, which is specific immunity. The characteristics of the adaptive defenses are that they are specific, meaning that when you start an adaptive immune response, it's going to be to a specific pathogen, and then you're going to have memory for that specific pathogen. So characteristics of adaptive defenses: it has specificity, which means you will produce lymphocytes specific to a specific pathogen. And it has memory. So as part of this production of lymphocytes, you're going to make two kinds of lymphocytes. Effector cells that carry out the response that's going to rid the pathogen from your body at the moment, and then memory cells that will hang out in your secondary lymphatic structures and await future encounter with that same pathogen. So, memory. The adaptive branch has memory because you produce specific memory cells to that, and that's what gives you immunity, or the ability to encounter a pathogen and not get sick. So another characteristic of the adaptive defense is that it has memory. We could say you form memory cells that reside in secondary structures and await encounter with the same pathogen in the future. This is what gives you actual immunity, or the ability to encounter a pathogen and not get sick. Okay, so what are the branches of our adaptive defenses? There are two: the cell-mediated immune system, or the cell-mediated immune response, and the humoral immune response. So the T cell response is one branch, and the B cell response is the other. So our branches are our cell-mediated immunity, which is the T cell response, or our T lymphocytes, and our humoral immunity. Remember, our body's fluids are our body's humors, and so this immunity is in your blood. It's all of the antibodies that are circulating around in your blood. So the other branch is our humoral immune system, and this is the part that takes advantage of our B lymphocytes. Okay, so lymphocytes. What the heck are lymphocytes? They're the cells of our adaptive immune response. And they are going to be very specific. So we're going to talk about three kinds of lymphocytes. Helper T cells, T sub H, these are helper T cells. And helper T cells are required for both branches of the immune system to be activated. Helper T cells are required in a cell-mediated response, and they're required in a B cell response, or a humoral response. So our helper T cells are required in both cell cell-mediated and humoral immunity. Okay, so our first type of lymphocyte, a T helper cell, is required in both cell-mediated and humoral responses. We're actually going to talk about the cell-mediated response first because of this. So since we're already talking about activating a helper T cell, we'll finish it out and talk about activating a cytotoxic T cell. Then we'll wrap back around and talk about the B cells, even though it's presented differently in your book. Okay, so the second type of T lymphocyte we have is a T sub C. This is a cytotoxic T cell. So if we look at this word, cytotoxic, cell, toxic. Our cytotoxic T cells are going to kill virus-infected cells. So when we activate cytotoxic T cells, they're going to start inducing death in our own body. So we really need to make sure that we're fighting an intracellular pathogen. So cytotoxic T cells are going to, we'll say, kill virus-infected cells. So cytotoxic T cells are going to fight intracellular pathogens and destroy your cells when they're infected. So these fight intracellular pathogens by inducing apoptosis like our natural killer cells did. So these fight intracellular pathogens, and we'll say they induce apoptosis in infected cells. And then the other type of lymphocyte we have is the B cell. And these are going to become cells that produce antibodies and are involved in humoral immunity. Okay. The other cells that are going to be important in our adaptive defense are antigen-presenting cells. So in order for our lymphocytes to be activated, they have to be presented antigen. And if you recall from our discussion of blood and self-antigens, antigens are things that elicit an immune response. So we really need to be able to present antigen to the cells of our adaptive immune response if we want to get things going. So the cells that can do this are macrophages, and then B cells actually become antigen-presenting cells. Dendritic cells can also be antigen-presenting cells. So our antigen-presenting cells, macrophages, are our biggest and kind of best, I think, I don't know, I like them most as far as antigen-presenting cells go. Dendritic cells are resident phagocytes in some tissues. So dendritic cells can also be thought of as antigen-presenting cells. The other ones that we're going to focus on are B cells. So B cells actually become antigen-presenting cells. They're going to then present that antigen to T helper cells to become activated to do what they do. So our lymphocytes are T helper cells, cytotoxic T cells, and B cells. Our antigen-presenting cells are going to present antigen to our lymphocytes, and they're going to be our macrophages and our B cells. All right, dendritic cells are resident cells in some tissues. In the thymus, the dendritic cells are going to help with antigen presentation and T cell training. So dendritic cells, resident cells in our thymus that help with T cell training. You have dendritic cells in other areas, but these are the ones that we'll worry about. The other antigen-presenting cells that we're going to talk about are macrophages, and these are just macrophages we find circulating throughout the blood and in our secondary lymphatic organs. So these circulate in blood and lymphatic, or in lymph. They migrate in and out of tissues. Macrophages are pretty cool. And then B cells become their own antigen-presenting cells to present to T helper cells. So they become antigen-presenting cells to present to T helper cells. So next we need to talk about the life cycle of a lymphocyte. So in a normal pace, face-to-face class, we probably spend a lot more time talking about this than we're going to in this class, but this is what gives us adaptive immunity, and what gives us memory is the ability to mount an adaptive immune response and produce a bunch of specific lymphocytes. So let's talk about the life cycle of a lymphocyte. So the life cycle of a lymphocyte, it all begins with production, or their origin in the red bone marrow. So all blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. So lymphocytes originate with their production in the red bone marrow. If you recall, we said that the primary lymphatic organs were the red bone marrow and the thymus. And what made them primary lymphatic organs is they were involved in the production and maturation of lymphocytes. So T and B cells are both produced in the red bone marrow. B cells are going to mature in the red bone marrow. So what does maturation mean? Maturation means that you learn to recognize a general class of antigen. What was an antigen? Remember back at blood when we talked about self-antigens? Antigens are just proteins that cause an immune response. So antigens could be things that are pathogenic and cause disease, or they could be things that are like allergenic and cause an allergic reaction. So an antigen is just something that causes an immune response. Self-antigens mark us as self, but they cause an immune response in someone else. So just remember that. So in maturation, you're learning to recognize a general class of antigen. So when you're mature, we'll say when you leave and you're done with maturation, you're mature, but you're naive, but immunocompetent. So you're immunocompetent because you can recognize a general class of antigen, but you're naive because you haven't met your specific antigen yet. So for maturation, our B cells mature in the red bone marrow, but our T cells have to go to the thymus. And that's where we'll have those resident dendritic cells that are going to present antigen to our T cells to test them and get them through their maturation process. So what is that? Well, T cells are going to destroy your body's self-cells that are infected. So we really need to make sure that T cells know what they're doing. Number one, that they can recognize antigen when it's presented, but number two, that they don't respond to self-antigen. So that's going to be a two-step process, and the steps are called positive and negative selection. I'm going to have Good tell you about positive selection.
In positive selection, the question is, can you bind to MHC? Because if you can't bind MHC, you're not going to be able to recognize antigen in the body. I know. So if the answer is no, apoptosis. If the answer is yes, you move on to negative selection.
And I'm going to have Chip tell you about negative selection.
In negative selection, the question is, do you respond to self-antigen? If the answer is yes, you're going to kill your cells. No good. Apoptosis. If the answer is no, you'll keep CD4 or CD8 and move on to the next step in your life cycle. Who knows what type of cells keep CD4? That's right, T helper cells. What type of cells keep CD8? You got it, cytotoxic T cells.
So at the end of negative selection, only about 1% of T cells are going to leave the thymus, which is pretty crazy. So most of them are destroyed by apoptosis. So at the end of negative selection, the T cells will maintain these proteins that are going to be able to bind to one type of our major histocompatibility histocompatibility complex or the other. They're the CD4 and the CD8 protein. So we'll write that information down now, and then we'll talk more about why that matters in just a minute. So at the end of negative selection, our T cells maintain either CD4 or CD8. If you maintain CD4, you're going to be a T helper cell. If you maintain CD8, you're going to be a cytotoxic T cell. So how can I remember which is which? Well, if I give this little 4 here a peg leg, it sure looks like an H. So T helper cells keep their CD4 proteins. Cytotoxic T cells keep their CD8 proteins. What are these things? These are proteins on the T cell surface that are going to bind to these proteins on antigen-presenting cell surfaces, or just any cell surface, and interact with these proteins here. So our antigen-presenting cells have to be able to talk to T helper cells. So they're going to have a major histocompatibility complex that can bind with that. Any cell that can get infected needs to be able to be destroyed. So any cell with a nucleus is going to have a protein that can bind with this. What are those proteins? They're called major histocompatibility complexes. So we're going to talk more about this in a minute too. This is just so we can get how these things bind. So we've got MHC1 and MHC2. MHC1 is going to bind with CD8. So all nucleated cells would contain that. MHC2 is going to bind with CD4. Why did I tell you this now? Because 2 times 2 is 4. CD4 binds MHC2. CD4 is what's maintained on our T helper cells. 1 times 8 is 8. CD8 is maintained on our cytotoxic T cells. Okay. So now that I'm mature, I'm immunocompetent, but I haven't met my pathogen yet, so I'm naive. So the next thing I do as a naive but immunocompetent lymphocyte is I go hang out in secondary lymphatic organs and await encounter with my antigen. So hang out and wait. Wait for what? The next step in my life cycle, antigen encounter. When I encounter an antigen, it's going to take this 2-step recognition process, and then I'm going to be activated to form a clone of cells. So what does this mean? Antigen encounter. I am presented antigen. And how does this happen? It happens through these major histocompatibility complexes. So MHC1 is the major histocompatibility complex 1. Major histocompatibility complex. MHC1 is on all nucleated cells. So any cell that can get infected has an MHC1 complex on its surface. MHC2 is only found on antigen-presenting cells. And if we think about who these were just binding to, this is going to bind to our CD8 protein on our cytotoxic T cell. These are going to kill any cell that can get infected. What's that? Any cell with a nucleus. MHC2 is going to bind to the CD4 on my helper T cells. And these are going to be required for both branches of the immune system to be activated. Both cell-mediated immunity or humoral immunity are going to rely on helper T cells. So antigen presentation can happen for either branch, so we'll be able to activate our helper T cells for either branch. So, okay, so how does this happen? How does antigen presentation work? Well, let's just imagine that you're a macrophage and you have encountered some pathogen in the body. Then what you're going to do is stick the antigen up into your MHC1 and MHC2 proteins. Okay, so once you have encountered your antigen and it has been processed and displayed in MHC1 or MHC2, you're going to have to undergo this 1-2 kind of co-stimulatory process so that you can be activated. So antigen encounter is going to lead to activation. What is activation? You're going to be activated to form a clone. What's a clone? It's a large group of cells that are specific to the specific antigen. So in this antigen encounter step, it's going to require multi-stage activation of our parent cell to get activated. All of the daughter cells then are not going to require multi-step activation. This huge clone of cells is going to be able to go out and carry out this effector response and rid the body of the pathogen. So we'll talk about the specifics of antigen encounter and activation in just a minute. The last step of a lymphocyte's life cycle is proliferation and differentiation. And what happens in proliferation is this clone of cells that we made is going to be produced, and we'll get a whole lot of cells that are going to differentiate into effector cells that carry out some effector response, and memory cells that are going to hang out and await future encounter with that pathogen. So where we really start to get different is in this antigen encounter stage and activation stage, and then your proliferation and differentiation stage. So when you proliferate, you're going to proliferate into effector cells that carry out an effector response. The effector response of T helper cells is to pump out interleukins. We'll talk more about this in a minute. The effector response of a cytotoxic T cell is to induce apoptosis. And then our effector cells in the B cell response are actually plasma cells. And they are going to pump out antibodies. Okay? So when we proliferate, this is this huge clone of cells that are going to be activated already to form the specific pathogen. And we're going to be able to differentiate into effector cells. T helper cells pump out interleukins. Cytotoxic T effector cells induce apoptosis. The effector cells in the B cell response are plasma cells that pump out antibodies. And then we will also make memory cells. These memory cells are what give us immunity. These hang out in secondary structures and await future encounter with the same pathogen. And now, let's say this is cold virus A we're talking about. Then my memory T cells, next time I encounter cold virus A, are going to immediately be activated to form a clone of cells that can fight. I'm not going to require antigen encounter and this two-step activation. I'm just going to immediately be able to fight off the pathogen when it presents into my body. So that's what gives us immunity. So my memory cells wait future, or we could say they await future encounter with the same antigen and mount a faster and bigger immune response. Mount a faster and bigger response. Okay, we're going to start with the cellular immune response because both branches of immunity require helper T cells. So we'll just talk about helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells, take a break and come back and talk about the B cell response. So for the cellular immune response, we have to get helper T cells activated in order to get anything going. For both branches you do. But in order for our helper T cell to become activated, for its antigen encounter and activation, it's going to have antigen presented by our antigen presenting cell in its MHC class II molecule. And it's going to recognize that with the CD4 protein. So this recognition of antigen presented in an MHC2 molecule is the first activation step. So first, we could say for antigen presentation, antigen is presented in the MHC2 molecule, antigen presented in MHC2 is recognized by CD4, and that's our first activation step. Now, we're going to have some co-stimulatory molecule involved. It could be a protein on the surface of our antigen-presenting cell that binds to a protein on the surface of the T helper cell, or it could be a co-stimulatory molecule that's released. Some second co-stimulation step is going to be required, and what's going to happen is my T helper cell is going to release interleukins that are going to come back and bind on it in an autocrine fashion. So this is the other type of cell signaling we have, autocrine. It's a message to self. And so what we could say happens for our second activation step is that the T helper cell releases interleukins that bind in an autocrine fashion, and this is our second activation step in now I'm activated. To do what? Form a clone. So now I'm activated to form a clone. A clone of what? A clone is now a large group of cells activated to this specific antigen. Okay? So that's the fourth step of a T helper cell's life cycle. The fifth step is going to be its proliferation and differentiation. So this proliferation is the formation of this clone. So I had antigen encounter and activation, and then I have that activation is going to lead me to form a clone of cells. So we can think about this as proliferation. So we'll proliferate into a clone of cells, which is a large group of cells that are activated to this specific antigen. And then I'm going to differentiate into effector helper T cells and memory helper T cells. My effector helper T cells are going to carry out my helper T cell effector response, which is to pump out interleukins. These interleukins are going to help activate our other lymphocytes. The memory T helper cells are going to hang out in secondary structures and await future encounter. Okay. Now what about our cytotoxic T cells? All right, they originate in bone marrow, they go off to the thymus, undergo positive and negative selection, and they maintain their CD8 protein. And then they go off and seed in secondary lymphatic structures and await encounter. So how do they get their antigen encounter? Well, this time our cytotoxic T cells are going to, remember, have our CD8 protein, and now we're going to have some either antigen-presenting cell or a sick cell that's going to have this antigen presented in our MHC class 1 molecule. So this is the first step in antigen encounter. So a cytotoxic T cell encounters its pathogen or encounters its antigen presented in an MHC1. Now, if this is all that happens, then these cells will just stay stuck that way. Because as soon as our cytotoxic T cell becomes activated, it's going to form a clone of cells that are just going to go start killing our own cells. And we don't want that to happen unless we're really sick. So the co-stimulation in the second stimulation step is really important for these cells, and that's why helper T cells are required. The effector response of our helper T cells is to pump out interleukins and help. Those interleukins are the second activation step for our cytotoxic T cells. So our first activation step is when we encounter antigen presented in MHC1. And that's all that's going to happen. In order to actually be activated, we have to have our second activation activation step, which comes when interleukins from an activated helper T cell bind to my cytotoxic T cell. So I have to already have activated a helper T cell. So let's say this helper T cell is hanging out in a lymph node and it's doing its thing, which is to pump out interleukins. So I'm a helper T cell, I was activated, I formed a clone, so there are actually a bunch of helper T cells here. We're in a lymph node and we're all doing our effector response, which is to pump out interleukins. Okay, well, interleukins then are going up, and now these interleukins can bind to my cytotoxic T cell, and it's activated. Activated to do what? Form a clone. So our first antigen encounter step happens when we're presented antigen and MHC1. The second activation step happens when interleukins from an already activated helper T cell bind to the cytotoxic T cell, and now it will be activated to form a clone. So I'm going to form a clone. Okay, so that's my proliferation and differentiation. So what does that look like for my cytotoxic T cells? I'm going to proliferate into a clone of cells that are ready to do their thing. I'm going to differentiate into the cells that are going to do that thing. What are they? My effector cells, which are my cytotoxic T cells, and my memory cytotoxic T cells. So I differentiate into effector cytotoxic T cells and memory cytotoxic T cells. Cytotoxic memory T cells hang out in secondary lymphatic structures and await encounter with the pathogen in the future. The effector T cells go out and carry out the effector response, which is to induce apoptosis in cells presenting this antigen in their MHC1. And they're going to induce apoptosis the same way that our natural killer cells did. So let's say this is blue cold virus, and here's my sick cell. He's presenting blue cold virus and MHC1. Now all of my effector cytotoxic T cells are not going to require the 1-2 activation step. They're effectors now that formed out of that activated clone. So their CD8 protein is going to recognize blue cold virus and immediately induce apoptosis by releasing perforins, which are going to perforate the membrane, and injecting granzymes so that my cell shrivels up and dies. The humoral immune response is the B cell response, and it's carried out through antibodies that are floating around in your blood or your body's humors. So our origin of B cells is in the red bone marrow. They mature in the red bone marrow. They leave red bone marrow naive but immunocompetent and hang out in secondary lymphatic structures awaiting encounter with their antigen. So how do B cells encounter their antigen? B cells fight extracellular pathogens. So their activation is slightly different than T cells. So our B cells have B cell receptors that kind of look something like this, and this actually looks a lot like the antibodies that their effector cells are going to release. So what happens to encounter a pathogen? A B cell has to actually bind several antigens in order to cross-link its receptors and respond. So the specific part of antigens that bind to and interact with your cells are called epitopes. So in order for a B cell to be activated, several epitopes have to bind lots of B cell receptors, and it's going to stimulate what's called cross-linking of the receptors inside the cell, and then will induce receptor-mediated endocytosis, where all of those bound receptors come into the B cell, and it can process the antigen and present it. So what's going to happen in our B cells, we'll say this is a bacteria, and all these little blue blobs are the epitopes, then our B cell receptors are going to bind to several epitopes of this antigen, So for antigen encounter, what we can say is that several B cell receptors bind antigen and cross-link. What does that mean? Well, inside the cell we'll have all of these changes that occur, so these receptors cross-link, and now this is going to induce in receptor-mediated endocytosis. So what does this look like? Well, if we were to zoom into the B cell, it's going to pull in this vesicle with all of those bound receptors. So that what happens is it pulls in this whole group of plasma membrane and all of the bound receptors, and now it can process that and become an antigen presenting cell. So after this we could say that so like maybe for a third step, the B cell processes the antigen and presents in MHC2 because it's an antigen presenting cell. Who's going to bind MHC2? CD4. CD4 is on our helper T cells. So guess what? We have to have a helper T cell activated to this pathogen. I'm not going to go over the helper T cell response again, but let's say that what we're fighting now is blue bacteria. In order to get past this step, we already have to have a T helper cell who's been activated to blue bacteria. So that activated T helper cell is sitting in a secondary lymphatic structure, pumping out interleukins. And now our B cell ingests and processes blue bacteria and is going to present blue bacteria in its MHC2. An activated T helper cell to blue bacteria can come along, and now we'll bind our interleukins, and now we can become activated to form a clone of effector cells. So, our third step is that our B cell processes the antigen and presents it in MHC2. Next, we could say our activated helper T cell binds, and then we'll put in parentheses with it CD4. And then we could say that it's going to, our helper T cell releases interleukins that bind to and activate our B cell. What is our B cell going to be activated to do? Form a clone. So I get activated to form a clone. What's a clone? Well, it's this large group of cells that are going to proliferate and be already ready to fight blue bacteria. So I form a clone, and I'm going to differentiate now again into my effector cells and my memory cells, but my effector cells are different this time. So I form a clone. Again, this is a large number of cells activated to the specific extracellular pathogen. And they're going to differentiate into effector cells and memory cells. My memory cells are just going to go hang out and await future encounter. My effector cells are different in the B cell response. In the B cell response, my effector cells are called plasma cells, and they release antibodies that are specific to this extracellular pathogen. Antibodies mark the pathogen for removal from the system in some other way that we'll talk about in just a minute. So our effector cells are plasma cells, and they release antibodies specific to this antigen. And this is an extracellular antigen. antigen. So I'm actually going to zoom ahead real quick to your antibody slide. We're not going to worry about the structure of an antibody too much. You can talk about that in an immunology class, but they kind of have these Y-shaped structures, and all of this part is like fixed. It's the same on all of our antibodies. What changes are these variable regions on the end. And those variable regions, these get programmed by the B cell receptor. When a B cell is specifying to an antigen, those variable regions are getting programmed to the specific pathogen that's in the body, or the specific antigen that's in the body. So now our antibodies have these ends that look like that variable region that can bind to the epitope on the antigen, and then this fixed region can be recognized by some other part of the immune system, or can be removed from the immune system in some way. So the structure of our antibodies is that they have these variable regions that get specified to the specific epitope we're fighting. And then they have these fixed regions that are the same and are easy to recognize. So we'll say easily removed, or helps for the easy removal from the system. I'm just not going to say anything to cut right there. Okay, so what do antibodies do? Antibodies mark the antigen for removal from the system somehow. What are the ways that we can do this? Well, there's got to be a poem in here somewhere. Maybe you can write it for me. They do neutralization, agglutination, precipitation, complement fixation, and enhanced opsonization. So the variable region of our antibody is going to bind to the epitope on the specific pathogen, and then we're going to be able to do different things using that fixed region in different ways. So neutralization, when you make something neutral, it can't have an effect. So what happens in neutralization is that you bind all epitopes, so the antigen can't interact with your cells. So if this is a bacteria and these are the epitopes, by sticking an antibody on here, I can just block all the epitopes, and if it can't bind with my cells, it can't do anything. In agglutination, I can stick all of my fixed regions together, clump them together, and then filter them out in some area like the spleen. So in agglutination, I am clumping together large particles. So this clumps together large particles. So I say I'm down to something here, and then I have another one here, and another one here. I can stick all of my fixed regions together and clump together large antigens. Precipitation is like agglutination, but for small things like toxins. So like you've heard of the tetanus shot, well that's to give you immunity against the tetanus toxin. So precipitation is when we use an antibody to stick something small like a toxin and then clump it together. So precipitation clumps together small particles. And then finally, we can use this fixed region to stick a complement protein to an antibody. And so that will enhance everything that complement proteins do, like opsonization, flagging for removal by a phagocyte, enhance inflammation, or enhance cell lysis. So complement fixation, we could say that we can bind complement proteins to the fixed region of an antibody and enhance everything that complement proteins do. Okay, so that's the B cell response. The slides that I skipped over, let's come back and look at. So it's hard to measure the number of effector T cells that go out in the body. So it's kind of hard to measure the effect of a cell-mediated how different immune responses work is that we can look at plasma concentration of antibodies to particular extracellular pathogens. So in a primary response, that's the first time you encounter a specific pathogen, and that's going to require your two-step activation and your proliferation and differentiation and all of that. In your secondary response, your memory cells are going to be immediately activated to form a clone of new cells, and they will mount an immune response so quickly and so strongly that in theory, you should not even feel sick at all. So that's what we're talking about now. So memory is what we get. Memory is what gives us immunity, and in our primary response, this is when we're forming our first memory cells to a specific pathogen. So in a primary response, this is the first time you encounter a pathogen. And if we were looking at a graph, and let's say this is the day that you are exposed to a pathogen, for the primary, you would start feeling sick. And let's say, I think it's about 5 days. In the first 3 to 5 days, you'll start seeing antibody level go up. So this is plasma antibody. And so you feel sick this whole time. I encounter it here. I'm feeling sick. On days 3 to 5, somewhere in there, my antibodies start going up. And after a little bit, I start feeling better. Antibodies go down. I'm good. So the primary response is the first time I encounter a pathogen, you get sick, and you form memory cells. Okay, this was blue bacteria we were talking about. All right, so let's say like 3 weeks later, I get blue bacteria again. Now I'm going to have a secondary response. And a secondary response is every consecutive encounter with blue bacteria, or every time you meet the same pathogen in the future, even if it's the 5th time you've seen blue bacteria, it's still a secondary response. So secondary response, this occurs with every consecutive encounter with the specific antigen. And what's cool about secondary responses is that they are faster and stronger. So again, here's our days, here's our plasma level of antibodies. So I'm just going to draw them. So now let's say we're feeling better, and here we get exposed to blue bacteria again. Well, in our secondary response, we're like immediately going to produce a bunch of antibodies, way more and way faster than the first time I had blue bacteria. So this time I don't get sick. All right, well, let's say green bacteria comes along. Does my immunity to blue bacteria protect me at all from green bacteria? The answer is no. So if I encounter green bacteria here, I'm going to get sick again. And after a couple days, I'll start seeing my antibodies to green bacteria go up. So your immunity to one thing does not give you immunity to another thing. Okay. So the last thing then that we're going to talk about is different ways that we can achieve immunity, and which is protection from disease, right? So we can get it actively or we can get it passively, and then in either way, actively or passively, we can also get it naturally or artificially. So what are we talking about here? In active immunity, I am actively forming lymphocytes to an antigen. So in active immunity, I actively form lymphocytes to a specific antigen. That's what makes it active, is that I'm actively forming this clone of specific lymphocytes. And this can happen naturally when I encounter the pathogen out in the environment. So if you're on spring break and the person that you're partying with has COVID and they rub all over your face, that's natural, active encounter, and it should give you natural, active immunity. So natural, you encounter the antigen out in nature or in the environment. Encounter the antigen in the environment. In the external environment. Or the natural environment. Because the doctor's office is also part of the environment, and that's where you're going for artificial immunity. Vaccines give you artificial active immunity. So what you do is you give like an innocuous version or sleeping version or dead version of some antigen to your body, and it still has that epitope that can be recognized by your lymphocytes. So it's active immunity because you're still actively making lymphocytes, but it's artificial because it's synthetic. The means of your exposure is synthetic. You're artificially being exposed to this pathogen. So that's what vaccines are doing. So you encounter the antigen synthetically. So this is like a vaccine for your flu shot. We're working on the COVID vaccine right now. Okay. The other way you can get some protection is passively. And this is passive because your body isn't doing anything to give you the protection that you're getting at the moment. So if you get bit by a black widow, you don't have long enough to mount a primary immune response and make anti-black widow toxin antibodies before you have neurological damage. So you need to race to the emergency room and get antitoxin right now. So that's passive immunity because you're getting protection. All that antitoxin that they're going to give you is going to bind up all the black widow venom in your system and you'll be protected, but it was passive because you didn't do anything in your body. I mean, you did have to get to the emergency room, but your body didn't actively produce anything. So passive immunity is your body is getting the protection from somewhere else, and it really only lasts as long as this external source is present. So it's not long lasting, it only lasts as long as this is there. So only short-lived. So a natural example of passive immunity is the kind of immunity a baby gets from the placenta, passing mom's antibodies through to the baby, and then also babies passively get immunity when they're nursing. So breast milk contains antibodies that mom's producing, and then we'll give babies some passive immunity. So that's natural. So we could say antibodies in mothers give babies immunity or some protection. I'll say some protection. And this is both from the placenta in utero and from breast milk during lactation. So I once saw a cool Facebook post where this woman who must have been married to a scientist and was also breastfeeding her baby showed these two different bags of her breast milk. And when a woman first delivers a baby, she's not going to produce milk right away. At first she produces this stuff called colostrum. It's like this straw-colored fluid that's high in antibodies. It gives that new baby some passive immunity right away. And it's yellow. It's like yellowish. And so after a couple days when milk protein synthesis really kicks up, milk will be white. Well, this woman showed these two bags of her breast milk, and one of them was really yellow like colostrum. So she or her scientist, whoever was the scientist, went and took it off and tested it, and what they found is that it more closely resembled colostrum. It was really high in antibodies, but it was high in antibodies to an infection that her baby was fighting, not her. So she wasn't sick at all. So what was really cool is that through the suckling that her baby was doing, it was exposing her body to the antigen, and her body made the immunity to it even though she didn't get sick. So that's one of the really cool protective things about breastfeeding. So that's a great example of natural passive immunity. And then the example that I talked about with the black widow bite, that's artificial. So in artificial passive immunity, what's happening is you have gotten bit by a rattlesnake or a black widow, and you've got this toxin in your body that's going to cause problems so fast that you call 911, you get in the ambulance, your friend takes you to the emergency room, whatever it is you got to do, and they give you antivenom. So what they do is they produce these antibodies in some other species, like a horse. So you can, like, you know, get the horse like over and over and over with rattlesnake venom. Not enough to kill the horse, but enough for it to start producing anti-rattlesnake venom antibodies. So then you can take those antibodies out of the horse's blood, and now when you race down to the hospital because you just got bit by a rattlesnake, they can give you these horse anti-rattlesnake venom antibodies to give you some protection. So all of those antibodies that you were given will bind up all of the rattlesnake venom in your body, and then once that gets cleared, you'll lose the protection. So artificial. This is when you are, we could say antibodies are formed in another organism and given to provide quick immunity. And then we'll say, for example, horse antitoxins are used in humans with deadly bites. Okay. So there will always be an overlap. You can't just have passive immunity, and you can't just have active immunity. What type is it? Is it natural passive immunity, like the immunity a baby's getting from its mom? Is it artificial passive immunity, like the immunity you get if you need an antitoxin? Is it natural immunity? Is it active? Am I actively forming, is it natural that I'm actively forming lymphocytes because somebody sneezed on me? Or is it synthetic, that I'm forming lymphocytes because I went down and got my yearly flu shot? So just remember that. And that wraps up our discussion of the immune system. Stay healthy, be well, don't get any COVID.